The African apocalypse highlights the inhumane treatment of black Africans during their transport to the Americas. Written accounts of events on slave ships will be highlighted in this video. Stories so horrific, you simply cannot fathom the depravity of those who claim to have civilized us. Let's begin. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, one of the darkest chapters in human history unfolded: the enslavement of millions of Africans by Europeans and Arabs. This period saw the loss of 400 to 600 million lives from Africa, a tragedy unparalleled in scale. The European slave trade inflicted the deepest wounds, destroying African empires and kingdoms, and forcibly taking away a staggering 12 to 30 million people, including children, women, and men. The story we are about to tell reveals the horrific conditions endured by these ancestors during their forced removal and the subsequent erasure of their humanity. A pivotal moment in this history occurred on October 29, 1665. On this day, King Vita and Kenga Antonio of Congo bravely faced the Portuguese in Angola, now part of modern-day Angola. In this battle, the king was shot and killed. The victors then gruesomely beheaded him, paraded his head on a stake, and later buried it. With this act, the powerful Congo kingdom crumbled, marking the end of 160 years of determined resistance by African monarchs against European domination and slavery. This event signaled a turning point, allowing European powers to intensify their enslavement of Africans without restraint, changing the course of history forever. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, there was a significant increase in America's exploitation industries and the enslavement of Africans. Initially dominated by the Portuguese and Spaniards, with the Vatican's approval, this trade soon included the Dutch, British, French, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Germans from Brandenburg, Swiss, European Americans, and European Brazilians. This cruel trade played a major role in enriching and developing Europe, which had been quite poor after the Middle Ages. The enslaved individuals mostly came from the once wealthy African states that had been weakened by Portuguese slavers. Local black leaders, often established by Europeans and reliant on cooperating with the West, played a role in this trade. Additionally, there were Arab intermediaries and the Lancados, so-called mixed-race individuals, born of Portuguese criminals and enslaved African women, who were raised to disdain black Africans and settled along the coast. This chaotic environment, rife with conflict and small-scale black bandits who aided in capturing and transporting slaves, facilitated the slave trade. Many enslaved people were prisoners of war, captured as part of European strategies to exploit rivalries between African kingdoms. Europeans would arm one kingdom to capture members of another, then offer the same deal to the opposing side. The result was a significant number of both soldiers and civilians being captured. The widespread capture of people led to a severe depopulation in Africa, eventually extending to areas like the Central African Republic, Uganda, and South Sudan. By the 19th century, a large number of the enslaved were children, due to the drastic reduction in the adult population. Raids often occurred at night, with victims going from sleep to enslavement in an instant. Many relatives died during these raids, and the elderly, considered unsellable, were left behind. Those captured were bound and forced to march to the coast, where many died along the way. Subject to beatings, threats, and despair, their attempts to escape were usually futile. Upon reaching the ports, they were chained and prepared for a life of slavery. The process of enslaving Africans involved stripping away their identities. They were forced to change their appearance, often by cutting their hair, a symbolic act to detach them from their roots and cultural identities. The goal was to transform them internally, erasing their individuality and turning them into mere objects for labor. Missionaries played a role in this process, using religious imagery to enforce a notion of white superiority and divine authority. This contributed to the psychological subjugation of the African people, who were no longer seen as individuals from diverse cultures and professions but were collectively labeled as Negroes. Before being transported, the enslaved Africans were held in coastal sheds and forts, where the conditions were abhorrent. Chained and whipped, they were surrounded by the constant sounds of suffering. Many died in these holding areas due to the poor living conditions. Uncertainty and fear were rampant, with some believing they might be eaten by their captors. The historian Levi Lemony Koko notes that suicides were common during the embarkation onto slave ships. Rituals were imposed in an attempt to combat despair, including walking around the tree of oblivion to forget one's past and the tree of return to ensure the spirit's journey back to the ancestral land after death. Despite these rituals, many still chose death over enslavement. The Europeans faced a logistical challenge: how to transport as many slaves as possible in limited space. Their solution was inhumane, prioritizing capacity over the well-being and dignity of the captured Africans. The conditions aboard slave ships were nightmarish. With little ventilation at the bottom of the boats, humidity and heat quickly became unbearable. Africans, suffering from diseases like dysentery and seasickness, were forced to live in their own filth. Pregnant women gave birth in these dire circumstances, surrounded by rats and an overwhelming stench. The environment was filled with despair, as people cried, suffocated, and experienced severe mental and physical distress. Confined in such conditions, they suffered from skin infections, pneumonia, and other illnesses. Many, overwhelmed by despair and depression, chose death. Smuggler Richard Drake described the horrific conditions after 8 days at sea, noting the unbearable stench and the sight of the sick and dying, some women giving birth next to corpses. Each morning, the dead were removed from the ship and thrown into the sea, often becoming food for sharks that followed the vessels. It's believed that around 2 million Africans were thrown overboard during these voyages. On deck, survivors, still in chains, were fed forcibly. Women were often raped by crew members, with some arriving in America pregnant. Despite their suffering, they tried to care for the children on board. The crew used buckets of water for cleaning and forced the captives to sing and dance to entertain them or to dispel their own sadness, using whips to ensure compliance. This violence was omnipresent, with the constant threat of being thrown overboard to discourage revolts. Suicide attempts were common, leading to the installation of nets to prevent people from jumping overboard. Accounts from various ships describe the appalling conditions: people crammed together, emaciated, sick, and dying, with the air so foul that crew members could only endure it for a few minutes at a time. One account describes 392 people, mostly children, crammed into a small ship, suffering from smallpox and other ailments, reduced to living skeletons. James Edward Bowley recounts the harrowing condition of survivors on a Spanish ship where, after 48 days, 200 of the 540 Africans had died. He describes the slave deck as incredibly cramped, with a height of only 5 feet 6 inches, making it hard to imagine how 540 people were forced into such a space. The survivors were afflicted with various diseases, many resembling walking skeletons, their bones visible through their skin. Many were too weak to stand, and the crew had to carry them out like sacks. Thomas Nelson echoes this sentiment, stating that most of the survivors looked like living skeletons, emphasizing the impossibility of truly describing the horrific reality. Robert Walsh also speaks of the unbearable conditions, noting the intense heat and offensive smell in the lower parts of the ship, which held 517 people of all ages and sexes, all naked and in desperate conditions. Slave traders commonly overloaded their ships, knowing that a significant portion of their human cargo would not survive the journey. These losses were coldly referred to as spoiled goods in their financial records, or as the French called it, deaths to be deducted. One notorious example of this cruelty was the Zone Massacre in 1781. The British slave ship Zone, originally designed to carry 200 people, left Accra, now in Ghana, with 442 Africans. En route to Jamaica, the ship took a wrong turn, extending the journey. With water running low, the crew decided to throw Africans overboard to conserve supplies and to claim insurance for the loss of slaves, which was allowed in cases of emergency. Despite rain replenishing the water supply, the crew proceeded with their plan. Over 3 days, they threw 54 women and children overboard on the first day, 42 men on the second, and 36 on the third. When the Zone finally arrived in Jamaica, only 208 Africans remained, indicating that nearly 50 had died during the extended journey. The approach of a slave ship to the Americas was often first detected by its foul smell, noticeable even from afar. Richard Drakes described the conditions on board, saying, "The blacks were tightly packed between decks, as if in a coffin, and indeed, the hold turned into a coffin. By the time we reached Bahia, a reference to Brazil, we had lost almost half of our cargo." The Africans who managed to survive the destruction of their states, wars, raids, forced marches, and the horrors of the sea voyage arrived in a deplorable state. For some, it had been 9 months since their abduction. To prepare them for sail, they were fed, cleaned up, and oiled to appear healthier and more presentable for the slave markets. Upon realizing they weren't going to be eaten, the Africans faced a new, harsh reality on the plantations, which were akin to concentration camps. There, they endured brutal mistreatment, disorientation, humiliation, and exhaustion, often leading to death. The slave ships, upon their return to Europe, carried with them the stench of their ghastly trade. This gave rise to a persistent myth about the smell of black people in the West that has endured to this day.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
The arrival of these slave ships in the Americas did not signify the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of a new, equally harsh reality. In the plantations, which were nothing short of concentration camps, they faced relentless toil, brutality, and the stripping away of their identities and dignity. Yet, amidst this suffering, the spirit of resilience and the unyielding will to survive persisted, sowing the seeds for future generations to fight for freedom and equality. In concluding this story, it's crucial to recognize that the history of the transatlantic slave trade is not just a recounting of past atrocities, but a call to remember, understand, and learn. It reminds us of the capacity for both great evil and immense resilience in humanity. As we move forward, let this dark chapter in our shared history serve as a stark reminder of the need for empathy, equality, and justice in all our societies, ensuring that such atrocities never occur again. We honor the memory of those who suffered and perished by striving towards a world that upholds the dignity and worth of every human being.